So I want to start talking about rights. We're going to talk about different political debates in this class, and in doing so, we're going to touch on a fair number of different issues. But one of the things, if not the main thing I'm going to focus on in this class, and one thing I'm going to keep coming back to, is this concept of rights. What rights do we have? Do certain laws, restrictions on certain behavior violate our rights? Do we have rights to certain forms of assistance? Those are the kinds of questions that are going to come up again and again in this course. And rights, or talk about rights, are pretty central, pretty important to the way that most people, in fact, I would say practically all people in the US think about political issues. Left, right, and center people talk about rights, right? Progressives, liberals will make claims that everyone has a right to health care. Conservatives, a lot of them at least, will deny that, right? Conservatives might say that people have rights to exceptions for certain laws due to religious belief. Liberals will be more skeptical about that, right? But the thing to notice here is, we like to harp on the differences between people on the right and left. That makes good TV in a philosophy class. We do it sometimes too. It makes for good debates. But the thing to notice here is that people who make these claims, even though they disagree with each other, they're not talking past each other, right? When the liberal says people have a right to health care, the conservative understands what he means, right? She might not agree with it, but she understands the kind of claim he's making. When the conservative says that certain people shouldn't have to follow certain legal requirements because of maybe religious commitments, liberals might not agree with that, but they understand her, right? All right, so rights are very important. They're very central to the way we think about politics. And there's another reason that I'm going to keep coming back to this issue of rights in this class. And that's just my own expertise, right? Factual issues, we'll touch on them. I can't avoid them. Do drug laws work? Things like that. We'll come back to them. We'll touch on those because we can't avoid them. But I don't claim to be an expert on these issues. I've done some reading up for this class. I've tried to get my facts in line. That's not my specialty. I'm not a criminologist or something like that, or a psychologist, right? But when it comes to rights, or at least rights in a certain sense, I do think philosophers have some expertise. So one of the reasons we'll focus on it, I think I just maybe know a bit more about this, right? But more than that, it is a really important thing in the way we think about political issues. Now, one thing I want to be clear on is what we're thinking of, the kinds of rights we're going to talk about in this class. In this class, we're going to focus on questions of moral rights. Legal rights are the rights the law says you have. Moral rights are the rights that you should have, whether the law recognizes them or not. We're going to focus on the moral rights question, but let me say why I think we can't ignore this moral rights question to start with, right? Because some people, I think, will make a move toward legal rights. They'll say, well, we don't need to talk about moral rights. Let's just look at the rights that the law says we have in society, right? What rights should Americans have? Well, we just pull out the Constitution and we read it. If it's there, we have that right. If we don't, we don't, right? Well, look, I had you guys read the Bill of Rights and the Civil War era amendments to the Constitution Because they are important, right? And they are a good way to start thinking about rights. The same goes for the UN Declaration on Human Rights, right? Most of the things on this list, I think most of us would recognize as important rights. But here's the thing. Neither list might be perfect, right? What do I mean by that? Well, I mean there might be some rights that they don't recognize, rights that legally aren't in the Constitution, or I don't know how much legal status the UN Declaration of Human Rights has, but rights that aren't there that people should have. Let me give you guys an example. When the Constitution was written, even, the Bill of Rights was ratified very shortly, almost immediately thereafter. But even when the Bill of Rights was ratified, women didn't have the right to vote. What's more, people could still hold slaves, right? James Madison, the guy who mainly wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, in fact, owned slaves, right? Look, I'm not, this is not me, saying, well, the Constitution's not impressive, that it's not a great piece of political philosophy. I'm just saying you can't read off the moral rights that people might have from any document, however admirable it might be, right? When the Constitution was written, there are very clear rights that we all think people should have. Rights not to be held as slaves, rights to vote no matter what your gender, that weren't protected. And what's more, people at that time did not have those rights, right? Or, think about it, in the context of other countries, right? Obviously, different countries are going to have different constitutions, different legal systems, and you and I and everyone else is going to want, in some cases at least, to be able to criticize them, right? I mean, think about it this way, right? The last I checked, I might be wrong about this, but it's a part of the law in Thailand, I think it might even be part of the Thai constitution, that you can't insult the king. You can't say nasty things about the king or the royal family. You will go to jail for that, right? Now look, I want to criticize that. I want to say, look, that might be the law of Thailand, that might be their constitution, but you should have a right to criticize the king or whoever else is in charge, right? Every person should have a right to say what they want within certain limits, but the right to criticize the people in charge, right? That seems to me a very fundamental right. And if a legal system doesn't have it, you can't just read off from the Constitution of that legal system and say, well, not here, no worries, moving right along, right? Whether or not the legal system gives you a right to criticize those in authority, you should have that right? So we need this concept of moral rights. Or I'll give you guys another example. Pakistan has some pretty strict blasphemy laws. You cannot criticize the Prophet Muhammad, right? If you do, you will end up in a lot of trouble. You can be executed, right? Now look, I think you should be able to criticize any religious figure you want, right? It might not be nice. You might be a huge jerk if you do it, especially in certain ways, right? But I think people ought to have that right. It's a right of free speech in the same way that the right of criticizing those in charge is, and it's also a right of religion, right? If you don't believe certain religious claims, you should be able to say that, right? So, We want to be able to criticize legal systems for not giving people rights they should have. That is one reason this concept of moral rights is important. We also don't want to think, because I think it would be lazy and kind of arrogant to think, that our own system, as good as it might be in some respects, is necessarily perfect, right? So even if there's no legal right in, say, the Constitution, that shouldn't instantly close this question of moral rights, right? Now, look, if you're a Supreme Court judge, maybe, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know this stuff. Maybe you should worry about reading moral rights and, just settle it on legal. There's huge debates about this. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to get into them. But as citizens, I think we need to be able to talk about this concept of moral rights, right? One more thing I'll note to you guys. The most worrying cases, probably, are going to be when people have moral rights. Rights to free speech or the exercise of religion, or rights to vote regardless of gender, or rights not to be held as slaves, that the system doesn't respect. We can also picture the system giving people legal rights that really don't have any moral basis, right? That might be annoying or stupid, right? Let me give you guys an example of this. This is a purely hypothetical example, right? Well, actually, the first part is very real. The second part is very hypothetical, right? I used to have some really obnoxious downstairs neighbors, just the worst sort of hipsters you can imagine. And, whatever, people are free to be hipsters if they want. Well, I'm not criticizing them for that, right? What I will criticize them for is that they all worked at this downtown brewery. This was when I lived in Knoxville, Tennessee. And they would get off pretty drunk. I guess they didn't run a tight ship at whatever brewery this was. They'd get off pretty drunk at about 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. They would come home, get very stoned, and start playing Mario Kart, right? Very loud. I don't understand why you have to turn the volume all the way up on Mario Kart. I don't understand what that adds to the Mario Kart experience. Now look, I got very, very angry at these people, right? Because I had to work very early on Wednesday morning. I've always had trouble with insomnia. So I would wake up 3 a.m. to the very loud sounds of Mario Kart, these idiots laughing, the wonderful smell of marijuana all throughout my room. I have to get up at 7. I'd go pound on their door. I'd yell at them. Things escalated. I talked to the landlord. Eventually they stopped. Not a pretty situation. But anyway, why do I tell you this story? Well, look. Obviously, the city of Knoxville, anywhere else, is going to have laws about noise, right? The landlord, when he made us sign the contract, had policies about noise. He was not so great at enforcing those, but they were there, right? Now look, these people could never in a million years claim that they had any kind of right to get stoned on a Tuesday morning and play Mario Kart very loudly, right? But look, we can imagine some bizarre legal system that has some kind of provision, people's right to play Mario Kart at whatever volume they choose, whenever they want, shall not be infringed, right? That would be a really stupid legal right. I can't imagine a system that would have it. And that's because there's no moral right to do that kind of thing, right? Our system hasn't made any mistake by not giving these people a right to do that, right? Another example, my parents had some neighbors who had a goat. It's way out in the country, right? And where they lived, Pulaski County, I don't think there's any laws out in Pulaski County about not having goats, right? In Norfolk, there are laws about not having goats. Pretty sure, I haven't checked this, but I think both in North Virginia Beach, I think you're going to get in some trouble if you have a goat in the city, right? Now, why do I say this? Well, again, we wouldn't think a system that bans people from having goats violates their rights in any way, right? We can picture some bizarre system that said, oh, the law can't make it illegal to own goats. That might be a legal right in some bizarre system. There's no moral right to do that. Most of us wouldn't think, right? So hopefully you guys get a sense of the difference between legal rights and moral rights. Now, in this class, we're going to focus on moral rights. What rights should people have? Whether or not the law recognizes that right, not the issue. Question is, should it? So, the important questions about rights. What exactly are they? We reach on both the right and the left. We Americans reach for this idea of rights really easily. But I'm going to bet if I ask you, not just to give me a list of rights that we have, but to define what a right is, I'm going to bet a lot of you would struggle. That's no comment on y'all. I bet the average person on the street would struggle. When I was getting ready to put together this part of the course, I honestly had to think a little bit about it. What exactly, have this vague sense what they are, but that's not good enough. I want something more precise. Well, what are they? A second and related question, why are rights important? I think all these questions go together, but, why is it so bad if a state violates people's rights? Now, sometimes you might say, well, it's just obvious if people can't practice their religion. Goodness, what could be worse than that? But, sometimes you might say it might not be obvious why certain things we clearly have a right to do, why it would be bad to restrict us. If I want to make juvenile, mean jokes about Joe Biden and Donald Trump's hair, there's a lot of material in both cases to work with. Trust me. I don't know, maybe I'm just getting self-righteous because I'm losing my hair and I feel like I'm accepting it with grace, right? Which they have not done. But anyway, right, if I want to say just mean, hateful things about the ways that they've chosen to deal with their baldness, well, why is it valuable to let me say that, right? Why protect that right if I want to be snotty and juvenile? People say mean things about the first ladies. Why allow that? Why protect that? That just seems mean. That just seems hateful. And yet, we would say people have a right to say those things about public figures. Well, in cases where it's kind of mean or hateful or we wouldn't like it, why would we say the rights are important? You can be a jerk and be exercising your rights. Why do we want to protect your rights when you're being a jerk about it, right? Finally, what moral rights do we have? Another way you might put this, not just what moral rights do we have, but what do those moral rights mean? Now look, I actually think that if we talk to liberals and conservatives and moderates and whoever, most people in America are going to agree on a lot of stuff. We might not realize that, but most Americans will say, yeah, religion, important. Free speech, important. Right to due process, meaning that to take something away from you or put you in jail, the government has to go through some kind of process, very important. We would all agree on some basic moral rights, right? The UN list might get a little more controversial. I'm going to guess some people might kick back on things like paid vacations, But for the most part, I think we would agree that those are rights too, right? But we might not agree on all questions of rights. You know, the liberal says people have a right to health care. The conservative says no, they don't, right? Or at least some conservatives will. And we might disagree on exactly what rights mean, right? Liberal and conservative both will say, at least most will say, look, people have a right to an education, fine, good, okay. But they might mean different things, right? What does it mean that people have a right to an education? Conservative will say, look, if the state gives some kind of support for people to go through K through 12, that's good enough, right? If we have public schools, fine, dandy, wonderful. You know, some conservatives might not even say that we need public schools. Some might just say, well, as long as the government gives people enough of a subsidy, if they're too poor to afford education, don't necessarily need public schools, that would be fine, right? Liberals, especially that latter claim, won't like that, right? Liberals might say, well, the right to education means that everybody should not just be able to go to high school for free, they should also be able to get a college degree, or at least 2 years in a community college, right? You know, liberals, even among themselves, might not agree, right? You know, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders say, well, people ought to have a right to go to college, 4-year degree. Joe Biden says, no, 2 years is enough, right? Community college, that's all a right to an education means. You know, so even if we agree on these rights, even if we agree what they are, a lot of times we might not agree on what they actually mean. And this is even leaving aside the more controversial ones. You know, we all agree that we have a right to free speech. We all hopefully agree that there are some limits to that, right? You cannot publish on the front page of the newspaper some false claim about somebody committing a crime they didn't commit, right? So where do we draw the lines for something like free speech? We have a right to it. We're going to have to draw the line somewhere. That's also going to be an important question. So next lecture, I'm going to start with 1 and 2. And, 3 is going to be a question we come back to over and over throughout the semester. But I think by getting a bit clearer on 1 or 2, or by looking at what I think is a pretty good answer to 1 and 2, I think we're going to start to get a better idea of how we might answer 3, right? I mean, look, I'm not going to convert you guys to whatever my views are. That's not the point of the class. But I think by looking more closely at 1 and 2, even if we don't all end up agreeing, we might end up in a lot better position to have discussions, to have arguments about 3.